Good afternoon. My name is Kkk, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. Lectures are held on the third Thursday of every month in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building at 555 South 10th Street in Lincoln. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Historical Society's programs and services, may be found on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube webpage. Today's speaker is historian Oliver Pollack. He is the author of the book Jewish Life in Omaha and Lincoln, A Photographic History. Dr. Pollack taught history for 38 years at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He is the author of over 10 books and about 150 articles on Nebraska Jewish history, some of which have appeared in Nebraska History. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pollack.
I'm pleased to be here. I first got the idea of doing this 3-4 months ago when I saw that they were discussing poorhouses at the brown bag lunch. And literally there was standing room only for the poorhouse presentation. So I approached Tom Booker, the late, and he said, sure, we take volunteers from out of Lincoln. I said, okay, well, I'd like to do something on adventures in Nebraska, parentheses, Jewish, parentheses, history. Since then, I thought about adventures could be cavalcade or divagations. So I'm very pleased to be here, and not so disappointed that there's not standing room only, because I understand I'm going to be on YouTube. And gosh, how many hits and likes can I get for that? Now, I am disappointed that Jim McKee is not here, because I was going to give him a shout out. I wrote this, I like to think of myself as the Jim McKee of Jewish Nebraska history. And I occasionally use a fountain pen. Yes. Okay. He and I both overflow with short, informative essays, and we are tied together by a word that we both enjoy, which is called divagation. And I found divagation means to do various things, but it can also be an illness, psychiatric, can't focus. No Jim here, but I couldn't waste that intro. This morning at 4:30, I had insomnia. I had forgotten to put the fan on above the bed, and I was all sweaty. Shouldn't tell that, but I put a pillow underneath my head and a towel on top of the pillow. So I looked up brown bag. I'm a historian of food for the last 15 years. And I've been to brown bags, and I've presented at brown bags, but I never inquired what it meant. And the best one was people walking the streets, obeying the liquor laws, have their booze inside brown bags. And we've seen that. Then it was somebody who couldn't have the lunch pail made out of metal or wicker. They used a brown bag. And then it was for informal getting together. And the first use of brown bag for a meeting, I checked the Oxford English Dictionary, and I'd never seen a brown bag in England. And I did the New York Times and found a brown bag. The first use for a symposium was in Honolulu in 1979. And that sort of verifies my ideas that brown bags started to come up in the 1970s. Wikipedia was not very helpful, but nonetheless, okay. So, all history is autobiography. So there's going to be a lot of me in here, not just that I wrote it, not just that I'm presenting it, but in great part I've lived it as well. And I also recognize that we stand on other people's shoulders. And so a lot of work done by earlier historians and our parents and our grandparents feed into what I'm going to present today. Now, I arrived in Nebraska in August 1974. When I interviewed for the job in Omaha, it felt just like today, steamy, humid. I got off the airplane at Epley, and I felt, oh my goodness, it's just like Mozambique. The the green is going to grow in my armpits so quickly. The last time that had happened, green growing in my armpits, was in Southeast Asia in Vietnam, where it was really steamy and sticky. I said, well, so I came to Omaha to teach at University of Nebraska at Omaha. My specialty was colonialism, and I had written a book on Burma. Now it's Myanmar, and I was going to go there. Back in 1970, always nice to see the area that you're going to write about. I didn't get there because I ended up getting a job in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And I don't want to go back there, but I am going to Burma in October, so you can wish me well. I'm going to have an eating tour. Okay, so arriving in Omaha with a Africa-Burmese background, it didn't resonate very well with the locals. It just had nobody to talk to. Students were dragooned to the classes, so what happened was I started to gravitate to my Jewish roots. We had children, so they had to be raised and educated Jewishly. And when the real estate agent asked me what parish would I like to be in, I'd never heard, well, I know what a parish is. Do you want St. Bonaventure, or you want St. Benedict's, or you put me in with St. Flanagan. He's up for sainthood, Boys Town. So bar mitzvah and joining a synagogue was fine. I turned to Jewish history. And what I did towards the late 1970s is I read the Jewish Press Index. Now, this portion of my presentation is about technology, methodology, and protocol, and how far we've come since the late 1970s. This is an index of the Jewish press. Carol Gendler, a very well-known benefactor for public television, Nebraska Humanities, and other nonprofits, got together some of the women in the National Council for Jewish Women chapter in Omaha, and they did an index of the Jewish Bulletin and the Jewish press. There's been a weekly Jewish newspaper in Omaha since 1916, coming up on a centenary. And I don't know how I came into this copy. You can see my name is on the right-hand side, Oliver B. Pollack, but you can also see the editor of the Jewish Press's name on the left-hand side. But he's no longer with us, and I own it now. And this is A through Z, what was in the Jewish press at that time for about 70 years. And it was only as good as the eyes and the patience and the fortitude and the words, the cognates, the index ideas that these women put together on index cards back then. And then I read the Jewish press from 1916 to 1948 on microfilm. Probably read it 3 times. How else do you get 150 articles? Then from 1948 to the present, it's on hard copy, big tomes. Starting the next 3 weeks, it'll be in hard copy and completely online. So there's really changes going on there. So, I'm off camera, aren't I? Okay, so here's some of the technology that I'm interested in. Jewish history. I'm interested in food. I'm interested in cookbooks. So my eBay has keywords: Jewish, Nebraska, and Iowa. And every morning I wake up, and every couple of months there's something in there that says Jewish Nebraska. For Iowa, it shows up maybe every month. And so towards the end of 2013, a Solomon Butcher photograph showed up on eBay, and it's still on eBay because it's $225. And why would you want to spend $225 when it's online with the Library of Congress and with the Nebraska State Historical Society? But what intrigued me about this was this is Seneca, street scene, Nebraska, and there's a Star of David, a symbol of Jewish life there. And by the way, if you didn't know it, you can't do this because the laser doesn't pick up on the screen. You have to do it down here. Okay? If you didn't know that, It's better than a brown bag answer. And next door is a restaurant, and it has a 5-pointed star on it. I got to tell you, Seneca is not the star city of western Nebraska. When we got copies of the postcard, I convinced my wife that we should visit Seneca. Here comes an adventure. And this is while they were still incorporated. As of about a year ago, they disincorporated. And we found one hotel. We went inside, and my wife says, "Drive me back home, honey. I'm not staying in this hotel." I left my $47. I didn't even ask for a refund. We arrived home at 2 in the morning. That's not to say it was a shabby motel. My wife has high standards. Okay. 4 seasons and stuff like that. So, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's going to take me 1,000 words to tell you what happened. It says 1905 online. I think it's closer to 1909. And I dug back and figured out who owned the drugstore. It was a guy named Moses Pass, P-A-S-S, and he came over from Kiev, Russia, probably in the 1880s. I've done passports, shipping records, naturalization papers, and what's that other thing? Register of Deeds. Turns out his wife's name was Yetta. It's a good Jewish wife's name. And his children were Ruth, Miriam, Emmanuel, and Raphael. No doubt about it, he was a Christian Scientist. No, he was Jewish. And to prove that he was Jewish, when he died, he was buried in a very small Jewish section of a Christian cemetery in Broadwater, Nebraska, where he had lived for 40 years. It's called Broadwater not because there's a great expanse of water there, but like so many Union Pacific people who had been generals and colonels, they got towns named after them. That's why somebody Broadwater. So on the shipping documents that he came to America, he was listed as a bookbinder. He went to medical school in Cleveland and in Kentucky, and he started practicing medicine. And he bounced around to alluring places like Elba, Nebraska, Wallace, Nebraska, South Omaha, Nebraska, Seneca, Nebraska, and finally Broadwater, Nebraska. What is going on here? Can't keep a job. No. He was a railway surgeon. The railways maintained or subsidized doctors at certain points where there were railroad equipment that people could get hurt on, and an occasional passenger might get sick. So that's how he supported himself. And so that story ends up as Stars of David in the Sandhills, a very short piece in the Nebraska newsletter, and a longer piece in Western States Jewish history. So, trained in Burmese and South African history, no background in American history, no background in Jewish history. What's important is the methodology of doing history can transport, can migrate, can repopulate, all those buzzy words, other thematic, geographic, and chronological periods. And so I self-made, hardly an autodidact, but language can be a limitation to doing some things. Okay, so, and I've always enjoyed looking at eBay in the morning. What's going to be there next? What can I get for nothing that they're asking $200? I just bought 2 Iowa cookbooks, Jewish cookbooks from Cedar Rapids, and we're going to have a show in Iowa on Jewish Iowa cookbooks. Okay, so now let me spin you back again with technology to 1996. I was teaching history at UNO, had a very good student, and he wrote a really good paper about the Thorpian Athletic Club. In the teens of the 20th century, Jim Thorpe, Indian outstanding athlete, his name was like Shakespeare. Thorpe Society, Thorpian Society. And so in Omaha, a Thorpian Society was founded about 1913. And this student wrote a really good paper. And I urged him, entreated with him, finish this up. make it better. This is publishable. And students have different agendas. They're not as obsessive about seeing their names in print. They just want the class over with, get the 3 credit hours and move on. But basically, because he didn't do anything with the subject, he foreclosed anybody else doing anything with the subject. A couple of days ago, I said, let's see what that technology can do. And I'm an avid user of Genealogy Bank newspapers, newspapers.com newspapers, and American Memory with Library of Congress. And so all the student had back in 1996 was the Jewish Bulletin and the Jewish Press in Omaha. So I spent 7 years looking for these 4 citations from newspapers in 1913. I think that's how long it would have taken me. I would have probably gotten divorced. My wife was, why are you looking for these things in the Omaha Daily News and in the Jewish Press and in the Bee? It took me 7 seconds to find out this information about the sports activities of the Thorpian Athletic Club in 1913. No work at all. Hardest part was positioning the printer to capture it. Okay. So I really enjoyed this one. Wherever the word Thorpian shows up, they put in a blank. So Thorpian put 1 over the Jinx Club. That was the team they played in basketball. But what's really fascinating here is the Jinx Club has a Bilk, an Orr, Talmadge, and Erickson. But the Thorpians had a Shantz, a Root, an Abramson, a Davidson, and a Reuben. Well, it's not the Reuben sandwich yet. That's another 10 years, and that wasn't how that Reuben was spelled. But on the spelling, there's this Abramson here, okay? It's a long name, and he was a long guy, as far as I can tell. I know the grandson. He's over 6 foot. I know his father, who's over 6 feet. I know their wives, and they're over 6 feet as well. So this has got to be the grandfather, Abramson. And he played basketball, because I bet he was a tall glass of water as well. So now I'm not saying I'm going to do anything with, there are about 280 entries in the newspapers. And how I've only looked at these 4. I'm not really looking keen on finding the other 276. But there's a better story there than there was in 1996. The author of the paper was John Mitchell. There's so many John Mitchells, and I've already started Googling him, and maybe I'll hire somebody to search him down. Attorney General for Richard Nixon, not that John Mitchell. John Mitchell, who owned radio stations in Omaha, not that John Mitchell. So the technology that's available to us to amplify, to enrich, to deepen the texture of our stories. And so Nebraska is, to a certain degree, at the center of digital research. Kay Walters at UNL, Nebraska State Historical Society, spending a lot of effort taking newspapers from microfilm and putting them online. Basketball was a Jewish sport, I'm told, because it was urban, it was indoors, and it didn't take a lot of space. And it was supposedly a non-contact sport. Okay, you get fouled. This is a group called AZA, Aleph Zadok Aleph, the largest Jewish men's association, young men's associations for high school kids. It was actually founded in Omaha in the 1920s, and then they branched out and had chapters everywhere else. So just as a sidestep, the Thorpian Athletic Society disappears after 1935. They aged out. It was the same, much the same people that were members in the teens and the 20s. By the 30s, they had lumbago and arthritis, and their wives wouldn't let them out or said, go play with your boyfriends. AZA solved the problem of continuity by being age exclusive, basically 15 to 19. And I don't know if there's an AZ8 chapter in Omaha. There is in Omaha. I don't know about Lincoln. So one of the people that was instrumental and influential in establishing AZA was a guy named Henry Monsky. Henry Monsky went to Creighton Law School in about 1911, 1912, was phenomenal guy. He's in the upper right-hand corner. There's a bust of him at the Jewish Community Center, probably in a closet or in the basement. He looks like a lion, protruding, thick, fleshy. And a very dear friend of mine, a graduate, 1944, of UNL journalism, a woman named Mary Fellman, said that when she headed the Jewish press and she had to go interview him, she shivered, she quaked. He was such a lion and such a man. And we'll talk more about him in a moment. I wrote a book on the history of Creighton Law School, and there's not a Jewish chapter in here, but threaded through here, there was a guy named Philip Klutznick who was Secretary of Commerce under President Carter, went there, and we built the water tower in New York, in Chicago. So these people, this is Francis Matthews, and he was Secretary of the Navy under Truman in 1949. This guy, Philip Horan, these are not Jews, went on to be a mucky-muck at Mutual of Omaha. This guy was a federal judge, Delahunt, for about 30 years. And this is Henry Monsky. And you can ponder this question. Father Flanagan is being touted for statehood. Well, maybe. Boys Town become a state? I don't think so. Being touted for sainthood, okay? And the person who provided the early funding for Boys Town and legal services was Henry Monsky. We don't have sainthoods in Jewish life. We have exhibitions. Okay. So this is from the early 1980s. The Jewish Community Center is at 132nd and between Dodge and Pacific in Omaha. And across the street, across 132nd Street, is guess what? Is Boys Town. And so there's a partnership there, just as there's a partnership between Creighton University and the Jewish community. Creighton did not have any quotas for the professional schools of law and medicine. If you didn't get in, it was because your grades weren't good enough, not because you were Jewish. So Monsky and Flanagan had a good relationship, and there's a Monsky Street, and Monsky's partner was a guy named Grudinsky. There's a Grudinsky Street in Boys Town. They're not very long streets, but they're there. Now, building on the shoulders of other people involves looking at what other people wrote. And this is a woman who was born Ella Fleischman. Her father was a rabbi, and he was a shochet. He was the ritual slaughterer of meat, which is pretty cool because Fleischman means meat man as well. Solomon Butcher, I can't figure out whether he had anything to do with meat at all. No tie in there. Anyway, Ella Fleischman got married, became Ella Fleischman Auerbach, and really bright, could write, and in 1918 went over to Europe to work for the Red Cross and the Jewish Welfare Society. What happens in the First World War is we couldn't have Jewish boys going to the YMCA, so the Jewish Welfare Society created groups where Jewish boys could go in the camps in the States and overseas. And Ella Fleischman Auerbach became the society reporter for the Omaha World Herald, and she was commissioned by the Nebraska State Historical Society to prepare two studies. One was Jewish settlement in Nebraska, which came out in 1927, and it unfortunately is just in typescript. And she identified Jews all over the state. How did she know that? She would talk to her father. Her father was not just a rabbi, not just a kosher butcher man, but he also met the trains when they came in with immigrants from the east. And so he had a memory of where things and where people went. But it's in typescript. I've read it. I should have it memorized, but I don't. And that's good, too. I don't have it memorized. She also wrote the history of the Nebraska Medical Association, about 1929. And that's truly printed, runs about 300 pages. So she liked to list things, all the doctors. And part of what she did helped me find Mr. Pass. But in the Jewish settlement of Nebraska, she never got out to Seneca or Elba or Wallace or South Omaha. She didn't have Mr. Pass in there. So that's okay. Gives me something to do. Now, you might recognize, but I'll tell you what's going on. We're proceeding chronologically. We did Creighton, Monsky in the teens. We did Thorpian, AZA going into the 20s. We just did Ellen Fleischman Auerbach in the late 20s. And where we're going now is to the tumultuous, horrific 1930s. And Nebraska played a curious and not so well-known role regarding Jews and the Holocaust. Just entered the Nebraska Hall of Fame, Alvin Saunders Johnson. Why does he have a middle name Saunders and it doesn't show up there? When his Danish parents came to America and settled near Homer, Nebraska, they were so pleased to be in America that they gave him the middle name of the current governor of Nebraska, Alvin Saunders Johnson. From Denmark, the family were Philo-Semites or Judeophiles. They seem to have an affinity that goes back to Denmark and leaving Europe with other Jewish immigrants, although they were Christian. He went to Lincoln and got a degree in classics. What more would you expect from a guy who came from Homer, Nebraska? Okay. Greek and Latin. And he realized pretty quickly that Greek and Latin would not have much sway in the 20th century, so he got a PhD in economics at Columbia. And he taught everywhere. He taught at Wisconsin, Texas, Nebraska, Columbia, Cornell. You could almost say he couldn't hold a job. So what does he do? He creates his own school. He becomes the first director of the New School for Social Research, the same school that Bob Carey directed during the first decade of this century. He was a humanitarian, and he was promoted to the Nebraska Hall of Fame, which is a big thing. Only one person is awarded that honor every 4 years. And I gave testimony on what he did during the 1930s. Number one, he created a university in exile. He basically cherry-picked German, Austrian, and French academics, economists, sociologists, historians, musicians, and got them jobs either at the New School for Social Research or he used Rockefeller money to support them in America. It improved the scholarship at the New School. You might think for a moment that all these people would be left or liberal, and you were right, except for one glaring exception. A man named Leo Strauss, who becomes the leading conservative theoretician preceding Russell Kirk, and he's at the University of Chicago. So, in great part, liberals with a couple of very conservative people. The other thing he did during many things in the 1930s is he created an agricultural colony called Van Eden in North Carolina. When he died in 1971 at a ripe age, his papers were sent to love library. Some of his papers are at Yale, some of his papers at the New School, but there are literally hundreds of boxes of his papers at UNL Special Collections. In that collection are letters from school children in the 1930s. Dear Mr. Johnson, I would like to work on a farm that you've created. My mother's a surgeon, my father's a lawyer. I'm sure I can do well as a farmer. And to those handwritten letters in perfect English are grommeted their pictures. The pictures black and white with grommets going through it. Now, that's not the fanciful cartoon character grommet. It's something else. You look at those letters and you wonder whatever happened to those kids. They were between 12 and 17. I suspect most of them didn't get here because there's no follow-up on it, but it's moving. And someday somebody should do something with those letters, maybe an exhibition. The Holocaust and Nebraska, because that takes us to another amazing character, David Kaufman, a merchant, store owner in Grand Island. A book came out on him and a newspaper article, Uncle David. And the Kaufmans had lots of relatives in Germany, and he figured out and used his private wealth to bring them over and to sponsor them so that when the immigration papers came in, he could verify that these people would not become a burden on the public purse. He would support them if they couldn't get a job. And Bill Ramsey wrote the book, Doorway to Freedom. And this is the law of unintended consequences. The people that I know who sits next to me, a bit older than me, in synagogue, last name is Kahn, K-A-H-N, Marcel. Went to Central High, and so did his brother, a guy named Gunter Kahn, who died recently. And although Gunter Kahn hasn't been of much use to me, he figured out that a blood pressure medicine named Rogaine was good for exciting the growth of hair in the right places. And so he made quite a fortune after a copyright and patent fight with other claimants, made millions of dollars, and then turned a good portion of that money to enhancing the library at University of Nebraska Medical Center, and half the library at UNO is named the Gunter Kahn Library. So these are people we know, and I suppose we love. Also during the 1930s, my grandfather went to concentration camp in Theresienstadt. He was a bemedaled First World War German officer, and he was getting old, so instead of extermination, he went to Theresienstadt, Hitler's gift to the Jews, and survived it. So I've become a speaker throughout Nebraska for the Nebraska Humanities Council. It's changed its name so often. Nebraska Humanities now, talking about genocide in the 1930s. So that would be the tie-in for an exhibit, Nebraska in the 1930s, The Long Echo. Nice title. Okay, moving on down my list of preparation, standing on the shoulders of others, is Carol Gendler, who we saw in the first index in 1974. She hustled and rustled together women to create the index, and she did her MA in history at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, but then it was Omaha University, and it was on the Jews of Omaha the first 60 years. It goes up to 1913. And she did it, finished it in 1968, long before there was this substantial flurry in Jewish history. And I've read this as well. It got published in 1974. I've read it 3 or 4 times, at least. You can see how, well, you can't see how worn it is. And why is it the first 60 years? She was writing in 68. She stopped in 1913. The Omaha Tornado, which went through a great portion of the Jewish community. She saw that. I've written 300 pages. I don't need to write anymore. let somebody else pick up from 1913, which nobody has done yet. There are other fruit to harvest. But she's interested in Jewish history and interested in public philanthropies. And quite a nice thesis. I'm glad it got published because I found it very useful to stand on her shoulders. Okay, coming into more recent times, for me, 1981 and 82 was very important. Morris Moline, whose index I have, asked me in 81, would I like to write something for the Jewish press? So, of course, yes. And I've been writing for the Jewish press for 35 years since then. Second, I got my law degree. That was always helpful. Didn't have to get paid for writing. I could make money elsewhere. Third, I met Mary Fellman, the person who graduated from journalism here in the 30s, whose sister is Annie Allen, the wife of Harry Allen, about whom I'll speak momentarily. And I wrote a letter to Marvin Kivett asking if they'd like to see my research on Jewish peddlers of Omaha. And Patricia Gaster responded, we would like to publish it probably later this year. Do you have any pictures you could send us to run with the article? My first embarking in professional Jewish history. And when I say professional, it means it's this shape, not the shape it is today. Infradignitatum, that's not quite right. But the more tabloid 8.5 by 11 is more popular. Anyway, I got lots of blue lining from Marvin and his minions. And I've always had a good relationship with David Bristow and Jim Potter and other people that tell me to keep writing, but write less. Okay. Let's see. And there's some handouts there, but that's what it looks like. Jewish Peddlers of Omaha, full of footnotes. Then, again, moving on chronologically, something happens in the early to mid-'80s. There's a proliferation, a mushrooming of Jewish studies in America. People with wealth, disposable income, Jewish, might create libraries, might endow hospitals, and they may say, especially if they are Holocaust survivors, we shall never forget. And so what happened is at Nebraska, they created the Harris Center. At Creighton, they created the Klutznick Center. And at UNO, they recently 5 years ago, the Schwab Center of Jewish and Israel Studies. And all the people that gave their name for the bricks and the mortar and the programs had made money in industry, real estate, merchandising. Now, this is a picture of Norman Kravosha, who I recognize, Harry Allen, and the late Sheldon Kushner. And I recently came across a letter written by Harry Allen in my files from 1984 when they were trying to raise money to have a course on the Holocaust at UNL. They raised enough money, over 100 students signed up for it. And judging from Harry Allen's letter, that was sort of the seeds for creating a larger program. And where the larger program at UNL came from was this benighted fellow, Norman and Bernice Harris. I think that's the cloak of the Innocence Club when he was a student at UNL. And he in retirement, he was well off. His children and his family were taken care of. Sort of like the Buffett theory, don't leave any of your children more than $5 million. That may not be the right number, but the numbers are so large that they're beyond my capacity to deal with. Too bad. So these programs bring visiting scholars in, maybe for a lecture, maybe for an entire year. UNO was lucky enough to have a scholar this last year who has written a novel about settler movement in Israel, reviewed in the New York Review of Books, reviewed in the New York Times, reviewed everywhere. And he taught writing to students at UNO. And back in 1981, Mary Feldman and I founded the Nebraska State Historical Society. Started out of a cardboard box and then in a closet with ham radio operators. And now it occupies quite nice space with 3 people full-time. And you can take this picture for what it's worth. It's either a picture of storage in, I guess they're called Demco or Brodart boxes, or you can see Tilly Olson about to kiss Oliver Pollack, or at least that's my fantasy. Tilly Olson came to Nebraska in 1905. Her parents fled Russia. They were lefties. I got into real trouble when I reviewed a book about Tilly Olson. She wrote Tell Me a Riddle, I Stand Here Ironing, Yonondio. Left Nebraska. She was born Tilly Lerner. She married a guy named Olson, who was really Olachevsky, a union organizer. And in my review, I said Tilly Olson was a socialist. Well, I know in the radio today we hear it was an insult to call Obama a socialist, and Bernie Sanders loves it. Well, the flack I got is, no, she wasn't a socialist. She was a communist. And how dare I call her a socialist? And so I had to relent and do a public in-newspaper correction. There was still the Cold War going on back then. The only other outward mistake I made is Norm Geske caught me in an obituary I wrote, and I got something wrong. And you can always fact check, but there's always going to be somebody smarter out there than you, or somebody whose family you've gored by calling the daughter a socialist. Anyway, she moved to San Francisco, and she was a wonderful woman. She was a Central High dropout, and at Central High's 100th anniversary, they brought her back and gave her her high school diploma. But the archives is rich in sources, and the book out here is Jewish Life in Omaha and Lincoln. And as you look at it, you'll see this, the pictures, the rabbi's a little bit higher here, he's a little lower here. And when it first came out, it was this picture. And on your left, they've chopped off the heads of some of the people. And somebody came up to me and says, Oliver, you've done a disservice to my aunt. You've cut off her head. I said, well, if there's ever a second printing, we'll fix that. And there was a second printing, and they did the cropping a little bit differently and lowered the picture. Same price for both, priceless. Okay. So what I'm getting at is, as the Historical Society looms in on 30 and 40 and 50 years, when people go from 3,000 square feet to 1,000 square feet to 450 square feet, there's the trash can, there's their grandchildren, which is the same as the trash can, or there's archives. And so the archives at the Jewish Community Center has been very gracious and has a deep pocket, or should I say, a big basement. And so these pictures are among the 200 that I culled down from a couple of thousand pictures. And when I did this in 2001, there were a couple of thousand pictures. There are many more pictures. It's like the internet. You go and look something up today, and in a month you look up the same thing, and there's 20% more on that subject than there was a month ago. another Lincoln photo. This is Governor Norbert Teman. And on your left is a guy named Willis Ross, who's a lawyer and real estate and insurance guy in Omaha. On his right is Jane Cohen. When I first came to Omaha and taught, she was one of my students for a while. And then to the far right is Rabbi Nadoff, Isaac Nadoff, who was an Orthodox rabbi at B'nai Israel. But I've dug back further. He used to be the Orthodox rabbi in Des Moines. So, and Jewish geography, just for a moment. I went to a wedding a couple, 3 weeks ago. A London guy teaching dentistry at Creighton marries a Costa Rican woman after all the visas and stuff like that. And he invites his friends from dental school. And one of them comes in, Jewish guy from Los Angeles, and he says, I'm in Omaha. I was born in Ohio. Rabbi Brooks was my rabbi in Ohio. Rabbi Brooks at Temple Israel was quite a figure for about 35 years. A little bit more about Nebraska. If you had asked in 1974, what's the stature of the University of Nebraska Press in publishing books about Judaism? Not only would you ask, are there Jews in Nebraska, you would ask, does the University of Nebraska Press publish any books about Jews? I think the answer would be low to not much. It's changed. The University of Nebraska Press now has one of the nation's leading publication lines in Jewish literature, whether it's Old Testament Hebrew Bible, whether it's Holocaust, whether it's Eastern Europe. And recently, in the last 3 years, the press has acquired the Jewish Publication Society, which was floundering economically in Philadelphia, and now it's a main line in Nebraska. Incidentally, Philadelphia is not doing so well with Jewish print. They got the Jewish Philadelphia Inquirer, I think, laid off 15 of its news reporters. The newspaper's been around over 100 years. They got fired last week because they're going to go to a news service and cut their costs by taking other people's reports and reducing the amount of local news. I hope that the Jewish press in Omaha going online is not a prelude to saving on paper. But here's one of the books that University of Nebraska Press published in 2004, Food and Judaism. And the bottom name may be familiar to you, Gerald Shapiro, a wonderful writer in UNL's English department, died a few years ago. And I just read his last unpublished short story, which is now published. And he wrote a book called Bad Jews. It's a hoot. One of the chapters is about a Passover food fight in Grand Island. I wonder if David Kaufman was there. In fact, I never really made the connection. I'm going to reread this. So, in that several chapter long book is one article by me, Nebraska Jewish Charitable Cookbooks, 1901 to 2002. So it's 101 years. Would you believe that Nebraska Jews have produced 25 Jewish charity cookbooks? These are the church ladies. These are the synagogue and the temple ladies putting together their recipes. The first one is in 1901, 1916, 1928, and it just gathers momentum. And of the 26, only 4 are identified as being in a library. This type of literature was looked down upon, not worthy of being accessioned given a Dewey Decimal number or a Library of Congress number. And that's why I search eBay for estate sales and things like that. And I know Father's Day is coming up, so I wrote an article for the Jewish Press about a month ago about Father's Day and Austro-Hungarian food, because my father's from Vienna. And I have to do a pitch to the editor, and I said about all the things, and I mentioned Schlagobers, which is whipped cream, and the editor emailed me back, "You had me at Schlag." So they took the article, and then they published it in a week rather than waiting until today, but they put a green sign like on the highway, "Father's Day is coming," or "Father's Day ahead." So I'm continuously thinking about topics, and so I'm coming in on my conclusion now, and my conclusion is history does not have a conclusion. It keeps happening, and as long as I'm awake and alert and employing my insomnia appropriately, fine. So the two hot stories this week is Father Flanagan and sainthood and what it means for the Jewish community. And this is the Jewish Press from June 12th, 2015. Sammy Sigma Alpha Mu returns to UNL. Jewish fraternities, Jewish sororities, like Jewish country clubs, had their roots in discrimination where Christians did not make it comfortable for Jews to join their fraternities or sororities, did not make it comfortable for them to tee off on the green. And so this says members in the past of this SAMI groups include Chancellor Harvey Perlman, Chief Justice of Nebraska Norman Krivosha, Legal Counsel to the United States President Lee White, and Olympic athlete Jim Hartung. Now, I would not have recognized Jim Hartung as a Jewish name. But the point is, it's a Jewish fraternity coming back, but it will be open for admission. Blackballing and other discriminatory quotas will not be permitted. Okay, I think I am about coming to my conclusion. I didn't see any liquor in any of your brown bags. I see plastic bags in your refrigerated box, and the speaker never gets a lunch. I ate beforehand, I'll eat afterwards. But if you have any questions,
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Why did he come to Lincoln? Way back when? Why did they come to Lincoln?
Why Jews came to Lincoln?
Yeah.
Well, way back when would be the 1860s. And the easiest answer is it was on the line of rail. And with the Union Pacific opening up, transport was facilitated. And the frontier always had opportunities for merchants, dry goods, professionals, lawyers, doctors, and some homesteading, some farmers. The question could also be, why did so few come to Lincoln? In the scale of things, Kansas City is larger than Omaha. Omaha is larger than Lincoln. And the magnets were really Denver and Chicago between the East Coast and the West Coast. But the railway is really important. Jews went into salvage and scrap iron in Hastings, Grand Island, I think even in Alliance, and their scrap yards, and it's a marginal industry. It's things that other people don't want to do, turning paper and rags into paper, turning metal and scrap, because the railway provided transport. And I think Solomon Butcher, as an example, not Jewish, took the railway and then probably hired livery, hired a wagon and horses when he got to where he wanted to get off the train and go into the interior and take pictures of sod houses and all the things he took pictures of. But they could have gone to Canada, could have gone to South in the many of them were peddlers. And there's a brand new book out on peddlers, came out 4 weeks ago, Yale University Press, Taking to the Road. I think it's Taking to the Road, 350 pages. And the only thing wrong with that book is I'm not mentioned. They didn't mention my groundbreaking 1982 article in Nebraska history. They mentioned Colorado, they mentioned Iowa, I mentioned Louisiana. I've talked to her about it, but unfortunately I talked to the author after the book went to press. So I am sort of miffed, and that's why I didn't bring a picture of it. Because you can be sure if I was in the bibliography or cited in a footnote, it would have an overhead on it. I do have hubris, after all. Okay. Did I repeat that question? I did repeat that question. Okay. I welcome any questions. Okay. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Seneca, isn't it? Seneca along Burlington Northern lines, isn't it?
I believe Seneca is along the Burlington Northern
Why
line.
would he be in Seneca? UP lines would be like 100 miles. Blonsky?
Did I say it was with UP?
Oh, I thought you did.
I don't know if I
You
did.
just said railroad.
Okay. I think railroad surgeons
Maybe.
took their opportunities. Now, what happens in Seneca, it had at the height a population of about 470, and they lost the workshop, I think, in 1922. Then the population went down to the mid-200s. And there were newspapers that lasted 3 weeks, a year and a half, and it's really interesting. The drugstore supplemented his income as a railway surgeon, supplemented his income as OBGYN and broken bones. And there were advertisements in the newspaper. The optician will be here in 3 weeks. The dentist will be here August 15th. Make your appointments now. So he served as a broker or provided space. Very interesting. I think it's a hard scrabble life. And Seneca wanted to be the county seat, but so did many other places, because being a county seat propped up life, although Thedford doesn't have that. Thedford is way better than Seneca. Seneca, the restaurant closed down and hasn't reopened. There's a post office boxes there. It's Mad Max in Australia after a great storm. And I lost $47 on the hotel room.
Oliver, there was some KKK activity in Nebraska. Was that any relationship between Jewish life and the KKK activity?
Question is, KKK activity in Omaha. The only KKK that I know of was probably in the 60s or 70s, and it met out near Epley Airport. And I'm making this up now, but there may have been more undercover people there than KKK. I don't know that much about it. It doesn't seem to have taken roots. Amy Fors wrote a book, University of Nebraska Press, about North Omaha, and another man wrote about his father, who was with the DePoor's Civil Rights Club at Creighton, and that was also University of Nebraska Press. And I should know this better because I reviewed both books for Nebraska history. But in both those books, the term discrimination was used, but nothing, to my recollection, about a significant KKK presence. I would say today that I was sad that the person I first talked to about giving this presentation is no longer with us, and I'm also sad, very sad, about what happened in, I guess, Charleston today, or yesterday. Yes, sir.
Interesting about being a student, I have a little bit of response to what he said. Back in the 60s, when I took a Nebraska history class from Bob Manley, we had to do a research project. And I got a couple of boxes of archives from a priest of the Diocese of Lincoln who was an amateur historian. And in that box, I found a postcard, and it was dated, by my recollection, 1920-21, and it was, the postcard said, it was addressed to one of the priests, and it said, the KKK is active in Lincoln, be careful, be on the watch, and it was signed the Sentinel. And so the Klan had activity at that point in time, I think, was anti-German and anti-Catholic, because that's who was here to be against.
Lincoln, was there a picture on the postcard?
You know, it's fun. I have a memory there was, but I don't remember.
In the 20s, there were a whole host of postcards that were anti-Semitic and anti-black, the watermelon postcards, Jews with large noses. But in terms of far right or far left or off-the-chart groups, Lincoln for a while hosted a guy named Lucas, head of the Locke.
In the 60s, 70s,
Yeah,
80s?
and then he got jailed for Nazi activities in Germany, where it was against the law to do that. Never had much traction, but you don't need to have too many people to create havoc when you're a fringe group. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Michael Dick. I'm in the history department at UNL, under Dr. Gerald Steinacher, and he does the Holocaust class these days. And I just want to let you all know that it's now the most popular junior, senior level course in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. The enrollment averages between 100 to 125 now per semester. We bring in survivors, and we get students attracted to us because they get the humanities credit, and they also get to experience and grab a piece of the Holocaust and Jewish history here at Lincoln.
That gives me the opportunity to say, am I done? You don't have to be Jewish to eat Levy's rye bread. You don't have to be Jewish to study and teach Jewish history. It's a wide open field. Thank you very much.